In 1984, I went camping about a mile into the woods in Dearborn County, Indiana. I had already heard some reports about Bigfoot being spotted in that area, so I made sure to tie our food up high in a tree. It was a clear, hot summer night, with a half moon shining bright. The encounter started with strange vocalizations from far away that slowly moved closer to our campsite. The woods were very dark, and the only light we had was from our campfire. We began to hear heavy footsteps, and as they got closer, we could hear splashing sounds as something rounded a pond at the bottom of the hill nearby. There were 5 of us, and we all freaked out and ran into our tents to hide. From inside the tent, we could hear branches cracking as the footsteps got closer. Then there was a loud snap, which we guessed was the branch breaking where we had tied up our food. We had put our food in a pillowcase, and soon we heard the unmistakable sound of plastic bags being ripped open and the crunching of snacks like chips and Doritos. Then we heard a sound like an aluminum can being torn apart. My curiosity got the best of me, so I peeked out from the tent. That's when I saw it. A huge, dark, hairy creature squatting down, licking out a can of my bean dip. It casually tossed the can into the weeds and kept rummaging through the remains of our chips. As I watched more closely, I walked up the trail a little closer, and I estimated it to be around 7 to 8 feet tall, with a very muscular build. It had large, powerful thighs and arms, and its body was covered in dark brown-black hair. Its head seemed to sit right on its shoulder muscles, kind of like a gorilla, and the worst part was the smell, like a dirty, wet dog. The next morning, we investigated the area. We found the bean dip can torn open, the branch that held our food had been pulled down, and the pillowcase was in shreds. As we packed up to leave, some guys came down from an old cabin at the top of the hill. They asked if we had messed around their site last night, because all their gear and food had been raided too. We told them the same thing happened to us earlier that night. After that, we packed up and left in a hurry. Later that year, I heard a story about some coon hunters and their dogs in the same area. Apparently, the dogs were hot on a raccoon's trail when they suddenly ran like crazy in the other direction, like something had really scared them. The hunters went deeper into the trail to investigate and saw what we had seen that night. In 1991, I was living with my brother in a small A-frame cabin in Harrison County, Indiana. It all started with strange sounds, howling screams from the woods behind our house. Those noises really scared us and the dogs, but we brushed it off until it happened again. I was about 20 years old back then, young and a bit foolish. I got the bright idea to shoot into the woods where the sounds were coming from. From that night until we moved out 2 weeks later, the screaming got closer. We kept firing shots into the air and into the woods about 200 yards away. The screams would stop for a bit after 5 to 10 shots, but then would start up again. One of my friends came over and decided to camp out in the woods. He was only there for a few hours when he said he saw something. He described it as a tall, hairy creature walking between 2 trees. He hightailed it out of there after that. The next night, my brother woke up to a large shape staring at him through the window. It must have been at least 8 feet tall. Another friend of mine wanted to stay over the following night to see if it was all true. That night, we heard a howl so loud it felt like it was inside the house. When we looked under my window, the one upstairs, we saw nothing, but the next day we found the back steps, made of heavy lumber, broken. Something had caved them in and splintered the door frame where the bolt met the wood. Our dogs were terrified. They wouldn't come when called and had made a mess all over the floor upstairs. The house itself was untouched, but it smelled awful, like a mix of feces, skunky wet hair, and urine. It wasn't overpowering, but it was strong and hard to ignore. I decided to move out the next day. I didn't think anyone would believe me, so I only told a few people. When I asked some locals about it, they thought I was nuts. A few years later, someone else bought the house. Interestingly, they disassembled it, put it on a flatbed, and sold the land. Maybe they had their own encounters. I guess I'll never know. It was a nice spring day in 1977 in Decatur County, Indiana. My friend and I were camping in a secluded spot where my parents had camped before. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and all the adults were at work. We spent the day tossing horseshoes and messing around while the campground dogs played nearby. I had brought my brother's .22 caliber rifle and some shells. In the afternoon, we headed down to the river to do some plinking at cans we'd lined up on the bank. As we were shooting, I used up most of my shells, leaving just one. Suddenly, I noticed how quiet it had become. There were no animals making noise, no dogs barking or birds chirping, just complete silence. Then, we heard a noise across the river, getting louder and louder. I told my friend that I was going to get some more .22 shells from the picnic table up by the horseshoe pit. Halfway to the table, I heard a loud noise and saw my friend running up the hill, screaming, "There it is!" I froze in my tracks, and my friend stood right behind me. There it was, a Bigfoot, with one foot in the water and one on the bank. It had rusty reddish-brown hair hanging over its eyes like a sheepdog. We stood frozen for about 5 minutes, just staring. I told my friend to really take a good look because everyone we told this story to would probably laugh at us. I had one round left in the rifle, so I took off the safety and told my friend to run to the car when I fired. I aimed the gun at the Bigfoot, but it didn't move. After debating with myself, I decided it wasn't trying to harm us, so I fired a warning shot into the air. Then we both ran like crazy to the car and drove straight home. When we got home, I told my mom the whole story. She didn't believe me at first, so I pleaded with her, saying I'd take a lie detector test because it really happened. On the following Sunday, Father's Day, my brother-in-law, who was 19, and I went back across the river in a rowboat to check things out. We found footprints everywhere, each with only 4 toes. I wear size 13 shoes, and I could fit my foot in those prints with a few inches to spare. My brother-in-law found a clump of hair stuck in a barbed wire tree a couple 100 yards into the woods by a cornfield. The tree had fallen and was stuck at an angle onto another tree. The hair matched the description of what I saw. We carefully put the hair into a Ziploc bag, although I sadly lost it over the years. After that, I heard stories from a few other people who had seen a similar creature in that same area. It seemed to like hanging around the river. In 1998, I had an unforgettable experience while backpacking in Hoosier National Forest. It was early March, and I decided to set up camp near the horse trails and an access point in the county just south of Brown County. That evening around 7 p.m., I had been hiking for several miles and was ready to settle down for the night. As it was getting dark quickly, I pitched my tent in a wooded area about 100 yards from the horse trail and started preparing my dinner. While gathering firewood and starting a small fire to cook, I suddenly heard some rustling in the leaves and brush below me, to the east, along a ravine. My first thought was that it might be a bit too early in the season for mushroom hunters, and it was getting too dark for them to see anyway. Maybe it was a deer, I thought. To be cautious, I grabbed my knife and flashlight and approached the ravine slowly, where the sounds were coming from. I yelled out in the direction of the noise and pointed my flashlight toward it. To my shock, I saw a very tall, human-like figure standing near a clump of trees by a stream. The creature looked to be about 7 feet tall, and though it was partly hidden behind the trees, I could clearly see its silhouette. It was leaning forward, peeking out at me with its head exposed. The light from my flashlight caught its eyes, revealing dark hair covering its cone-shaped head and dark eyes that stared right back at me. I knew right then that this couldn't be a person. Terrified, I yelled again, trying to scare it off. The creature ran into the stream and then ducked behind another tree about 6 feet away. I kept my flashlight on it and continued yelling, hoping it would leave. For the next 2 or 3 minutes, this strange being moved down the creek, and finally it ran off out of sight. Too scared to sleep, I stayed up all night by the campfire, constantly on alert for any sign that it might come back. I even considered packing up and leaving, but I knew my truck was in the same direction the creature had run, and I was miles deep in the forest. That night was intensely frightening. I never imagined I'd encounter something like Bigfoot, especially not in Indiana. I always thought if such a creature existed, it would be in places like the Cascades or the Canadian Rockies, not here.